Your Creative Push, episode 167.
Don't give up, because the more you try, the more you will start chipping away at the wall, and eventually the wall you'll be able to pass through.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngman Brown, and my guest today is Zachary Petit. Zach is the editor-in-chief of the National Magazine Award-winning publication, Print, author of The Essential Guide to Freelance Writing, How to Write, Work, and Thrive on Your Own Terms, and a lifelong literary and design nerd. At one point in time, he was the senior manager of How Magazine, Print, and Writer's Digest, as well as the executive editor of many other related newsstand titles. His words also regularly appear in the National Geographic Kids, National Geographic, Mental Floss, and McSweeney's Internet Tendency, just to name a few. Most recently, Zachary has curated the book Treat Ideas Like Cats, which unlocks the secrets of creativity as it collects the inspiring and insightful words of artists, writers, designers, and thinkers who have had the courage to create. And Zach, thank you so much, first of all, for coming on the show. Let's start out with the new book. I have it here in my hands. It is beautiful. It is awesome. Let me ask, what inspired you to create it?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm stoked to be here.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It was a book that I never really anticipated actually doing. For years, ever since I was a teenager, I would always, write in my books and sort of block out different things as I was reading them. And I've always just kind of been a collector, hoarder of quotes. And it started off as just kind of a fascination. I'm like, oh, this brilliant little witty one-liner this person said carries so much weight. That's amazing. And I originally had like an old notebook that was filled with them. Then that eventually turned into a sort of giant screed of a Word doc where I keep things now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was sitting there and, at Writer's Digest where I used to work before, I did a big collection. It was like 78 quotes about writing or something like that. Mm-hmm. And people really responded to it. And so I was like, okay, maybe I'm not the only nerd who finds inspiration and beauty in these little quotes. I just finished the book that I did on freelance writing, and I was like, I wonder if any publisher would be interested in sort of a neat little small Victorian-looking book that's just filled with quotes. Sure. And after a lot of back and forth with the publisher, the tiny little cloth-bound edition evolved into a bigger book that they got a great illustrator for. And it's awesome. So now there's all these amazing quotes that are awesomely illustrated. And I'm really stoked. And like you, I got the first copy the other day, and I'm just really kind of blown away by it. The illustrations are super cool that she added to it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the in today's world, I think people don't have patience to read a whole book. Like the idea of like reading an inspiring book is like a massive undertaking, and it's almost like too overwhelming, especially if you need that kind of inspiration. It's probably because you already can't get to the stuff that you don't have the time to do the stuff, so you need kind of bite-sized things. And I'm obsessed with quotes too. And I mean, the Instagram account for this podcast is just quotes. It's just quotes from the episodes that hopefully people can take. What do you think is like the fascination, aside from like not having enough time, but like what makes these like bite-sized, words of inspiration kind of so effective?
It's so fascinating to me that whether these were written or whether they were said by somebody, just that anybody can have something come out of their mouth or their mind that's some of these to me are kind of the equivalent of like reading an entire book on something. They just carry so much power in so few words, which has always fascinated me. And it was interesting when you were talking about sort of the notion of books and self-help books and creativity. And to be honest, I hate books like that. I hate that shit where it's, an entire thing on some aspect of your life that you could get in a much more digestible format or some other thing that somebody basically is just profiting off of because of that. And so, that's why it's kind of funny that this book on the back of it, I'm looking at right now, it says self-help / creativity. So that's funny that I wrote a self-help book. But I think in terms of, people slowing down and reading a book, what I find fascinating about this is that there's basically one quote per page. And that to me is cool because it really encourages you to sort of slow down and take it in, as opposed to if you were reading all these, in just one long article or something like that, which is how, a lot of times, especially online, things are presented. And so I don't know. I feel like it's good because it sort of encourages you to think a little deeper about the quote. It really gives the quote its full due.
Yeah, and there's something about minimalism that I like too, and that's like one of the reasons I like Twitter as like, I find Twitter to be almost like an art form, to be able to get, a poignant thought out in however many, it's like 144 characters, whatever it is, to be able to condense it into that really makes sure that you get to the heart of like kind of the matter. And I think that's why why quotes are so fun too.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not easy. That's probably why I also suck at Twitter.
Yeah, I suck at Twitter too.
I take a lot more words to try to explain something than the brilliant people who are featured in this book ever have.
Right. Well, I think that's the other interesting thing. Like, we're talking about the self-help books as opposed to like self-help kind of quotes. Self-help books and stuff like that, it's almost like they're telling you what to do. Whereas like if you read a quote, you can kind of apply it to your own life, your own situation, and kind of tell yourself your own story and almost give yourself the advice, even though like somebody else is like saying the words. You have to be the one to kind of apply it to your life and figure out like kind of what you have to do to apply it.
Yeah, totally. I think like that, you hit the nail on the head. That's really the key to it all, is just sort of interpretation. And, I think when, I go to a lot of conferences and things like that for work, and to me, the presentation that I hate the most is the person who's standing up there saying, okay, here's the story of how I became famous. Because really, that doesn't give you a path to follow. And it's kind of the same way with self-help books that are like that, saying, okay, here's the concrete way to do this, when there's really no one-size-fits-all solution for creativity, for anything,
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes that's the hardest part, is to kind of go to the unknown, to kind of go to that place that nobody has kind of ventured, to create your own path, but it's the necessary steps.
Yeah, and I think there's a great degree of mystery in creativity, and I think that's what really makes it beautiful, and also what makes it so that, everybody has to define their own path. There's really to say it again and be redundant, there's really no one size fits all. Right.
Well, do you have a favorite? Well, let's say this. Do you have like a favorite quote that applies to you, or do you have like a story of like a particular quote helping you in a particular situation to kind of find your own path?
Yeah. So originally the book had a Charles Ames quote. It was "Never let the blood show," and we were originally going to title the book that before we realized it would probably freak some people out. Yeah. But I think like that to me is such a good emblem of the creative process, because it is, it can look so flawless when somebody writes a great book, when somebody directs a great film, but beneath all that, there's so much blood and sweat and tears that went into it. And I think like people who are creatives really understand that. And so to see somebody like Charles Ames say that, it just carries a lot of weight when you look at this beautiful minimalist furniture that he's designed, and really knowing, all the pain and suffering that goes into any creative act.
Right, and that's kind of the purpose of this podcast, is to see the blood, to have like people from all different, creative walks of life and all different journeys and lengths of time. People have been doing it for 1 year, people have been doing it for 50 years, and seeing like the same kind of bloodshed, the same kind of pain,
exactly.
That everybody, I think that can really be useful. Yes, never let the blood show, but like if you want to help people, definitely show them that blood and show them that, that pain that you had to go through. Yeah, for sure. And I think that's why, that's why I like your podcast too, is because it's, it really does show that there is no single path to success or to creativity. Everybody gets there in their own way. Absolutely. Well, thanks. Thanks for saying that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, so you've had, aside from this book, you've had a very kind of storied and very diverse career. So can we talk about that a little bit, and your kind of creative origins, and then like some of the things that have been resistances for you, like along the way?
Yeah, for sure. So I got, I started out by knowing two things. One, that I really like to write, and that, whenever I wrote something or created something, I just felt more alive than if I had not. Mm-hmm. And two, that I was really shitty at math. So that made deciding to become a writer, a pretty obvious path for me. And so, originally I wanted to be a novelist. I wrote a bunch of really bad poetry in high school in those years and things like that. And so I figured, okay, I would go to journalism school, and, that would teach me to be able to get paid to write while I could do these other things on the side. And then eventually become a famous novelist or something along those lines.
Of course.
Yeah, exactly. And, but when I got to journalism school, it's really bizarre. I don't know how deep we want to get into it, but I discovered feature writing, which is basically, like an in-depth profile of somebody. And, I really started to fall in love with journalism because, it really kind of taught me that you can put as much heart, drive, and passion into something as you would a fiction, but it's real, and you have sort of this real, I don't know, just the reality of it always fascinated me. And so that's why I was always kind of, in my journalism, I've always been interested in sort of the deeper stories that people have and sharing those stories with people. And so I always wanted to be a magazine writer, but I was doing an internship at National Geographic magazine, and I asked all the big, fancy, world-traveling, awesome staff writers how I could become one too someday. Mm-hmm. And their advice was to go work for a newspaper for 10 years. So that was a disheartening horror.
Like, are you sure?
Yeah, I'm like, really? Can't you guys just hire me? But I moved out to the middle of nowhere into a very small town and got a job as the police reporter. And that itself was worth 1 year of doing that itself was worth more than 4 years of journalism school, just because it's kind of like a boot camp for writing. And I guess in terms of challenges, that's another one, is that I could not get a job at any newspaper. I tried, I started at like nice top tier publications, got rejected from all sorts of fellowships, but really just wouldn't give up, because that was really all I had, was this bulldog notion that I was going to do it, come hell or high water. So I finally conned and convinced, after much badgering, this newspaper to hire me without a lot of reporting experience. And from that point, my entire goal was to just prove myself by writing as many articles as I could, and really just get into the type of writing that I wanted to do. Everybody on staff hated doing what they called a 1C story, which was the big weekend feature that would be more like a magazine story and more in depth. And everybody hated it just because it was like immensely time consuming. But I sort of turned those 1C stories into kind of my bread and butter. I wrote about all the weird shit that's always kind of interested me. I wrote about dog whisperers, like supposedly haunted places. I got a thing for interviewing Santa Clauses, like mall Santas.
Yeah.
And I've done, over the years, I think I've done like 8 or 9 mall Santas, and it's just always like hilarious and delightful. Mm-hmm. And so, like, for me, like, I've always just been driven by finding just the weird side of things, and like the way, just the deeper things that lay beneath the surface, and just sort of bringing those to life and bringing those to people.
And then do you find that, like, you look at life differently since you started doing that? Like, you're kind of always looking for like that the odd side of things that other people don't see?
Yeah, and I think like part of that just, it goes hand in hand with being a writer too, and especially, if you're a journalist or a reporter, is that whether you realize it or not, you sort of begin to develop a sixth sense that's always aware. And so anytime anybody's talking about something in your head, you're like, oh, that can make for an interesting story. And really, it's just a matter of indulging your own curiosity, and then being, having the courage to sort of follow that and take it to where it may lead.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what about for people that don't kind of have that courage to follow up on something that they find like interesting, but it involves a certain amount of putting themselves out there? Do you have any advice for them to kind of, scratch that itch?
For sure, yeah. And I've always been, I'm not really an outgoing person, nor am I social. And so like, for me, like, when you get a job as a reporter and you have to go talk to people you've never met before, that you're only going to know for a short amount of time, it's hard, and it takes a lot out of you. And so, I sort of developed, I guess, a sort of like a reporter persona where like it would be something where I'd be comfortable talking to people. I'd be comfortable, giving talks and things like that. And it took a lot out of me to sort of develop that. But once you do, and once you have sort of the way that you interact with people professionally, especially when it comes to interviewing, it just becomes more of a routine. And I mean, I guess it's the cliche, you do something enough, it'll stop terrifying you. Mm-hmm. Whereas that's really what it took for me.
Yeah, I think, even for me podcasting, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, I still get nervous, even calling you today, there should be some level of scaredness that happens to make you, to keep you on your toes, so that it's not too much of a routine. But yeah, like being able to just, I guess, get comfortable with yourself in a certain role. Yeah. Be comfortable with yourself as a musician, like taking certain steps to create something very out there, being an artist, making unique lines on the page, or being a writer, being like super honest or super blunt or super out there, I think it just takes a certain amount of kind of comfort with it.
I think with any creative act, if you're doing it it's something that you want to do, I think, there comes a point where you realize it's not necessarily a matter of wanting to do it or having a choice to do it. You really have no choice but to do it, especially with writing. If I'm not writing and trying to create things, I just feel miserable inside. And so it's sort of like that inescapable creative drive is really what you need to embrace. And yeah, I mean, it's terrifying, but if you have no choice but to do it, then you'll figure out a way to do it and a way to put it out into the world, even though it may be completely terrifying to you.
Absolutely. It's just doing it every day, just like continuing to like embrace that terror and just continue to do it. And it does get easier over time. Yeah,
definitely.
Do you have a worst moment or, like a hardest time, especially having to do with like kind of, what we're talking about, putting yourself out there or just like getting the work done?
Yeah, I'd say like, it's interesting because I work, I'm the editor of print magazines. So that's my 9-to-5 job. And, after work, that's when I do things like write books, freelance for different places. And so in my house, my very charming office is in our unfinished basement. And so, I mean, it's hard to, as you know, because, you said, you work a full day job after this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. And so, I mean, like, it's really, that to me is where it takes the most courage and the most drive, is to come home from working 8 hours, working 9 hours, and then having the courage to walk down those basement steps and sit yourself down at the computer and say, okay, I'm going to do this, no matter how tired you are, no matter how fatigued. And it's never easy, but once you sit down and you've done it, you always feel better. And I think that to me is sort of the risk and the reward for it.
Yeah, it's like going to the gym. It's like I can't think of anything like that I don't want to do. Like even more. Like I can't stand the idea of going to the gym, but I always feel like better for the rest of my day. Like when you get home, and it's the same with being able to kind of create something out of nothing. Yeah, and you're like, okay, like I feel somewhat accomplished. Yeah,
exactly. And I use writing as an excuse not to go to the gym too, so that solves that problem as well.
Well, that's true. But there's also things that you have to sacrifice. You do if you are, walking down the steps after work and saying, all right, I'm going to do this. There's inevitably something that you used to do, in that time that you have to give up. And it's sometimes a tough break from whatever that thing is, but you do have to kind of find that balance and the things to sacrifice.
Oh yeah, exactly. And I think too, it's like those things, I have my wife and I have 2 dogs that we're obsessed with. So it's hard to walk down away from them. It's hard to walk down away from my wife and say, okay, I'm going to go write for 3 hours and disappear. But yeah, but I think like I said, like if you are designed to do it though, you really have no choice but to do it. And so to me, that's always the big challenge, is finding balance between your life and your creative passions and your day job.
Absolutely. My wife and I have 2 dogs that we're obsessed with too. And actually I have the opposite problem. It's trying to keep them away from the recording. And sometimes like if my wife's at work, I'll put one of them in her crate because she's good, but the other one will just be downstairs barking the whole time. And she has me in an appearance occasionally barking when the mailman comes or whatever, but she'll usually be sitting by my side during it. Yeah. Just like, I can't get them away from me. What kind of dogs do you have?
I have a rescued greyhound and a tiny Papillon Chihuahua who breaks the stereotype of Chihuahuas being mean. She's really sweet.
Oh, nice.
But that's the blessing of working in my basement, is that the dogs are scared to go down the open back steps, and so they'll just sort of sit at the top. But yeah, it never fails. Anytime I do a lot of interviews with different people internationally for National Geographic Kids, and it never fails that any time I do, there's like the mailman comes by or there's some sort of eruption. So I'll be sitting there like with my recorder to my ear, like desperately trying to hear through this accent while there's like a chorus of dogs barking.
It's the worst. And then the neighborhood dogs go too. Ugh, it's tough.
Yeah, once that's set off, all bets are off.
Yeah. How about, National Geographic Kids, how did you get involved with that as opposed to, I know you do some work for National Geographic as well, sure, but you're primarily with National Geographic Kids, right? Yeah,
it was an odd turn of events. So years ago, I had applied for a job at National Geographic Kids, and went through all the different stages and the steps, and then the editor called me and she said, we're hiring somebody who has more children's writing experience, but we'd love it if you would write for us. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. Sure. And so that just sort of started a years-long process where I get to delve into all these, fast things that fascinated me as a kid that continue to, like mummies or, cursed objects like the Hope Diamond and stuff like that. And I mean, like, it's when you're writing articles like that where you're like, you have this sudden moment of clarity, like, okay, I went through all of these shitty paying newspaper jobs, all of these things, but then you get to sit there and laugh at the fact that now, you're getting paid to write about all of these things that have always fascinated you, that have always blown your mind. And it's really just a remarkable thing.
That's so cool. And then, but is it hard to do it like for kids, like in a voice?
Yeah, it's to be honest, it's the hardest writing that I do because
I would imagine
to be able to take, what did I do? One of the stories that I did was on, scientists had found out, through different analysis and through different, scans and x-rays that they believed that King Tut died on a chariot. And so the challenge then is to take, 7,000 words of explanation to adults and then figure out a way to distill that so that a kid can understand it. And so it's just insane. And then you have to make sure you don't use any references that are pre-2005. And I mean, it's an amazing, people are always surprised, but it really is the hardest writing that I do. And, has taught me a lot about, conciseness and brevity and stuff that I carry over into my work for, quote unquote adults.
Right, and then to still make it kind of inspirational or to make it fascinating to kids too, like at the same time as you're trying to teach it, I guess you'd probably make a good teacher at this point.
Oh yeah, thanks.
So if you decide to retire from writing, that's your next gig, okay?
I'm actually teaching a journalism class for the first time at University of Cincinnati in January, so we'll see how it goes. Oh,
cool. Good luck, dude. That's awesome. What are some of your fears for that?
Well, I always, just in general, I don't like public speaking. I mean, I'm great when I'm speaking like with a class or something like that. But, for my job, a lot I have to give, lectures to big groups of people and things like that, which has always sort of terrified me. I mean, I've gotten more used to it over the years, but it's still one of those things that makes you slightly uncomfortable. But like you said, I think it's good to be slightly uncomfortable and to not settle into only what you're good at, what you're comfortable with, because you learn a lot, I think, by doing things that terrify you.
Absolutely. So how about like a best moment?
I had a sort of an interesting creative moment with the last book that I did. It was, I worked for Writer's Digest magazine for a number of years, which was a joy because I was a huge nerd and I got to interview a lot of my favorite writers, which was, being a nerd, that was like the greatest thing on earth. And,
and it's Writer's Digest.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so I think some of my highlights were talking to a lot of the writers that I've always admired. And, when you're a journalist, it's always the best feeling in the world when you interview somebody you admire and you still admire them by the end of the interview.
Right. Because it could go the other way.
There's a lot of people over the years, I won't name names, but who I've been like, well, not a fan anymore. And that's horrible.
Right.
But, interviewing Anne Rice, she was amazing and genuine and warm-hearted. Andre Dubus III, who wrote, House of Sand and Fog. It was one of those interviews you do, as you know from doing interviews, where it's one of those things where you sit down and you talk to somebody and you feel like you're just having a beer with an old friend.
Exactly.
And then it really shines through in the story that follows. And that to me is when you get, really an honest take on somebody and the most fun to write.
Yeah, that's one of the best things when it's like you have that instant connection with somebody where it's like you're friends, and you can get to like the heart of things and, be able to ask somebody, what scares you about being a teacher, or like what scares you about, you know what I mean? Where you can just feel comfortable kind of in that safe-ish environment. Yeah.
And like the more stilted the interview, the worse the story will be. And so that's like when you have an interview like that, it's electrifying.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And then the people listening feel like they're a part of it too, or the people reading feel like that they're there with you, Yeah.
And I think like, especially with like, if you're interviewing celebrities or something like that, to me, the challenge is always doing so in a way where you feel like you've gotten some degree of the truth of who they are. My favorite thing to write is profiles. And, there's nothing worse than coming away from an interview and being like, well, that was the same thing that they've said to 10 million other journalists. And, so it's like trying to break through those canned responses and really to get a slice of their life, because that at the end of the day is what people want to read, versus just the same rehashed thing over and over.
Right. Because as we kind of said before, it's like being able to see like their journey, their path, their unique path can kind of help you to find your unique path, even if it's not, anywhere near what they did. It's just like kind of like finding that bravery to go your own way.
Yeah. And I think, like the more you read interviews with creative people that have had success, the more you listen to interviews and things like that, you start to build in your mind a mosaic of how you could accomplish, how you could make that path and how you can make it your own and then actually have it be something that's feasible for you.
Would you have any advice for people to do that? Because like you talked about your, Microsoft Word file of just tons of quotes that you would just open up to look at for inspiration. I have similar things. I just have like what I call a treasure trove of inspiration. We've actually talked about on the podcast before. And I'm actually planning on doing a solo episode about it too, of just,
Awesome.
Like we talked about, like being a writer and just kind of always being a writer, seeing things as a writer. Oh, this could make a good story. Oh, this could make a good character, and just kind of storing that away, like for later. Yeah. Would you have any advice for people that, to do that, to like kind of create their own like Microsoft Word document or their own kind of treasure trove of inspiration?
Yeah. I think it comes again to sort of learning to turn your antenna on. And so just sort of as you're reading, going about your day, reading about stories that fascinate you, reading about people who fascinate you, it's sort of just whether you do it, in a notebook or you just sort of store it in your mind, just a matter of picking up little tidbits like that. Like, okay, this person did this. I love that. And I would also like to do that. And the more you do that, the more grains of sand you accumulate, sort of the desert of how you're going to do this begins to form. And, and I mean, it's like you said, it's like my collection of quotes. That really was kind of the purpose of that, which is interesting because I've never thought about it that way before. But yeah, it's just building up your world and your realm and sort of going rung by rung, taking these inspiring things and trying to see how you might make them your own.
I love that. It's perfect advice, man.
Thanks.
Now, how about aside from, like quotes, because that's what this whole book is about, which is I really can't recommend it enough. Like it's the perfect thing to have kind of either like by your bedside or by your desk, or just anytime you need a little bit of like a pick me up, just pick it up.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, would you have any other things that you look for inspiration, like YouTube clips or, books? Like we talked about just the massive amount, of hesitancy people have to read an entire book for inspiration, but anything like that you draw inspiration from?
Yeah. And one big thing for me is conversation. And, I like to get together with, my friends who have nothing to do with the writing world, the graphic design world, anything involving creativity. Just because to me, it's delving into other mindsets. And I guess it's sort of similar to what we were talking about cherry picking bits of advice from people. I feel like there's so much that you can come across in conversation that then, will sort of breed into your subconscious, and then you can bring it out later in your work. Aside from things like conversation, I like to read outside of normal subject matter that you think I might be interested in. Just because I feel like, again, there's so many takeaways. If you're a nonfiction writer, there's so many takeaways that you can get from fiction. Or if you're an artist, there's so many things you can take away from looking at other styles and really sort of delving into the history of everything. And I feel like the more you do that, the more your own voice and your own work starts to become your own, because it really is just the cumulative effect of every writer that you've ever read, every piece of art that you've ever seen, and basically how you take it and distill it to be your own. It seems like a small step, regardless of what creative discipline you follow. There's always a huge internal battle when you finally give yourself the permission to say, okay, I'm a writer, or okay, I'm an artist, I'm a musician. And I think, once you overcome that, once you give yourself permission to use that title and to really own it, that's when you can really start coming into your own.
Yeah, for sure. You start to believe it yourself, and you start to take steps to become a good writer, a good artist, you know what I mean? It's like you're giving yourself that permission.
Yeah, and it just seems less of, when you really start to own it, it just seems less of, you feel less guilty about, okay, well, I'm going to do this without calling myself it, but then you're driven more once you finally owned up to what you are to actually accomplish it.
For sure. And also going back to what you said before about just having conversation with people, I think conversation is like a lost art, and certainly something that I had to, even with the podcast, had to like relearn.
Oh, yeah.
It's so much easier just to send a text message with the pertinent information, like, okay, meet you here at this thing, at this group setting, and we won't have a conversation there either. Like, you know what I mean? And I think that it is important to kind of make a point to sit down and talk to your friends. Like, just this isn't even like a creative thing. This is just, just in life to sit down and talk with your parents, talk with your kids, talk with whoever. Like, when's the last time you actually had a conversation, like a meaningful conversation with your sibling, with your mother or father? Like, learn about them, it's really super inspiring to be able to do that.
Yeah. And I think, communication analysts and things like that will look back on the time that we're at now and just be kind of awed about how quickly everything changed, and the turning point that really is occurring now. But I guess like the one upside to that is, when you do have a meaningful discussion with somebody, it really means, I guess, so much more maybe than it felt like it used to when you have a good conversation now.
Absolutely. And kind of like we were talking about before with like the, like a great interview is when you can kind of have that conversation. And, it's just super obvious that connection is made. Like just like treat it almost like not like I kept bringing up the parent thing, but like sitting down with them and just like asking them a question that like, I don't know, like sometimes if you ask somebody like a question that's maybe difficult, like, oh, how did you get through that like tough time like 20 years ago or like before I was born? Like, what was that like? You know what I mean? And really listen to the answer. Like people are honored to like be asked that, like to really have somebody interested in them, and it can just make for like such a better connection,
Yeah. And it's interesting too, since, we were talking about how people want that honesty when they read a story, and you want that when you are, when you're writing a story, maybe that is because of the digital age has stripped so much from us. And, by reading things like that, you feel like you get a semblance of it back. Yeah,
the digital age is great for a lot of things because we get to talk on Skype and just, hit a button and we get to record a podcast interview. But at the same time, it's also taken a lot away from us. It's stripped us of that, and it's going to continue to go that way. So we have to like kind of hold on.
Yeah, exactly.
Man, Zach, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's time for the final push though. And this is where I ask you to reach the microphone and grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you've already really inspired today and just give them your best words of advice and really push them to pursue their creative passions. And you're allowed to use quotes of other people if you want.
Okay. Yeah. My secret arsenal. I would say really don't be afraid to embrace the gifts that you have, and don't give up, because the more you try, the more you will start chipping away at the wall, and eventually the wall you'll be able to pass through. So don't give up and don't fear it.
Just keep chipping away. I love it. Zach, thank you so much, man, for coming on the show today and for giving us that push, man.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And you can find Zach at his website, zacharypetit.com. That's ZACHARYPETIT.com. On Twitter, he is Zachary Petit. You can find everything we talked about today on the show notes page at yourcreativepush.com/Zachary Petit. You can also get the new book, Treat Ideas Like Cats. I highly recommend it. It's a perfect, as Christmas is coming up, the perfect gift for a creative person as well. So we'll have links to go purchase that as well. Zach, thanks again, man.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a blast.
My thanks to Zach for coming on the show. And you know what? This was one of my favorite titles of an episode too. Embrace the inescapable creative drive. Because like Zach said, if he isn't writing something or creating something, he feels miserable. I get that too. And if you have that same feeling, stop trying to escape the gravitational pull of your creative passion. If the creative drive wants you, it's got you. And you can't escape it, so stop trying. Just give in. Just give in. You'll feel so much better. Don't listen to the fear. Don't listen to the laziness that wants to hold you back. These voices that keep coming back in your head that tell you it's not worth it. It's not worth your time. You're not going to make it. Tell them to shut up and just embrace that thing that keeps pulling you towards it, that makes you feel guilty when you don't get the stuff that's inside of you out of you in your creative passion. You know how good it feels on the other side of it when you've done the work, when you've put in the time, and when you've spilled that blood that Zach and Charles Yames talked about. I hope that this podcast in general has shown you how much blood so many of these creative people have spilled, how everybody goes through pain, how everybody has these same doubts. So there's no reason that you shouldn't go through them too, and that you shouldn't approach them bravely, and there's no excuse to not get through them. All you have to do is put in the time and face those fears, face that terror, face that fear every day. Whatever it is that's holding you back, embrace it. Embrace that fear as well as the creative drive. You know how much you're going to regret it if you don't, so please go and do it. That is all I've got for you today. Hopefully you were inspired to go and get your work done, to embrace that inescapable creative drive, and to put yourself out there in your work. Once again, that book is Treat Ideas Like Cats. It is available everywhere on Friday, and we'll have links to go buy it at our show notes page, yourcreativepush.com/Zachary Petit or yourcreativepush.com/167. On Friday, we have a solo episode, a special one for you, and a special announcement as well. So that is for you on Friday. But until then, go and get some amazing work done, and we will see you then. I love y'all. Bye. never miss a push. Head to yourcreativepush.com/subscribe to find the easiest way for you to subscribe to the podcast.